Hello viewers, today we are starting a new chapter, Inflammation and Repair. This is the first lecture, so we will just have an overview of inflammation in which we will study about the definition and the general features of inflammation. So what is inflammation? Inflammation is a response of vascularized tissues that delivers leukocytes and molecules of host defense from circulation to the sites of infection and tissue damage in order to eliminate the offending agent. So inflammation is a response of vascularized tissue. So the vessels, they play important role in inflammation, that delivers leukocytes and molecules of host defense. So what are the mediators of inflammation? These are leukocytes, antibodies, complement proteins. So these are normally present in the circulation, and whenever there is injury or whenever there is infection or there is necrosis, so these mediators of inflammation, they are rapidly recruited to that site. And what is the function of the inflammatory response? It is to eliminate the offending agent. So we can say that inflammation is a protective response that is essential for survival. So inflammation is, so infection and tissue damage, these, so from the definition we can understand that infection and tissue damage or necrosis are the important causes of inflammation. So inflammation helps to remove, or with the help of inflammation, the host is able to eliminate the causes of cell injury, the microbes, toxins, and the consequences. Tissue damage is the consequence of cell injury as well as tissue damage. So the host is able to remove the causes as well as the consequences of cell injury with the help of inflammation. So what will happen if inflammation or the inflammatory response is not there? If there is no inflammatory response, what will happen? The infections, they will remain unchecked. The wounds or the damaged tissue, they will remain as such. They will remain as permanent festering sores. There will be no healing of the wounds. So by this we understand that inflammation is a beneficial response, or inflammation is a protective response for the host. Now from the definition we can make out the causes. So what are the causes of inflammation? So the first one is infections. Infections can be caused by, or infections can be bacterial, fungal, viral, parasitic, and inflammation can be elicited by bacterial toxins. Now the inflammatory response, it depends on the pathogen as well as on the response of the host. So it can be acute self-limiting, it can be severe, systemic, or it can be chronic inflammatory response. So it depends upon the infectious agent as well as on the host. Now second is tissue necrosis. Now in the chapter of cell injury, we have studied about the various causes of cell injury and cell death. So any injurious stimuli like ischemic injury, chemical injury, physical injury or trauma, irradiation, so they can lead to cell death and necrosis. And the necrotic or the dead cells, they release some molecules that are identified by the mediators of the inflammation, the cellular mediators of the inflammation, and this triggers inflammatory response. Next is foreign bodies. Foreign bodies, for example, splinters, dirt, sutures, they can also elicit inflammatory response by two mechanisms. First, they can directly injure the tissue. They can cause trauma to the tissue, and also they may be carrying microbes which will elicit inflammatory reaction. Now some endogenous substances like urate crystals, cholesterol crystals in atherosclerosis, they can also elicit inflammatory response. Now fourth is the immune reaction, also called as hypersensitivity. Now this can occur, this can cause considerable tissue damage. This can occur as a result of immune reaction against one's own antigens or one's own cells. So immune reaction against self antigens. Here immune reaction against self antigens. It is seen in autoimmune diseases, and also the allergic reactions to harmless environmental agents, like food, drugs, or when the immune response is not adequately controlled or adequately regulated, like the allergic reaction to insect bites, etc. So these are the causes of inflammation. We use the suffix itis after an organ or tissue to denote its inflammation. For example, appendicitis. This term is used for denoting the inflammation of the appendix. Conjunctivitis, pharyngitis, endometritis. Now the inflammatory response, it proceeds through a sequence of steps. Now what are these steps? So what are the sequence of events in the inflammatory response? First is the recognition of noxious agent or the initiating stimulus for inflammation. Now the leukocytes, the macrophages they have, and also the dendritic cells, they have receptors. They have receptors to recognize the microbial products. They recognize the microbial products, the toxins, and the damaged tissue or the damaged or the dead tissue or the necrosed tissue. So they have receptors to recognize the microbial products, toxins, and the damaged tissue. And once these receptors, these are engaged by these antigens, then there is release of mediators, which triggers or which initiates inflammation. Now what are these receptors? These are toll-like receptors. These are present on various types of cells, leukocytes, epithelial cells also. So when these toll-like receptors, they are engaged by the microbial products, they lead to release of certain mediators which triggers inflammation. Now node-like receptors, they sense the necrosed or the dead cells. So these node-like receptors, now these dead cells, they release certain molecules like the uric acid, ATP. These leak out of the dead or the damaged cells, and these are identified by these receptors, and these receptors then stimulate a multi-protein complex, which is the inflammasome. So this inflammasome then induces the production of interleukin 1. Now this interleukin 1, it recruits leukocytes, activates leukocytes, and thus it triggers inflammation. Now the cells, they also have, the leukocytes, they also have receptors for the Fc portion of antibodies and also for complement proteins. So when the microbes they are coated with antibodies or the complement products, so these are readily identified by the leukocytes, and this coating, this is called as opsonization. We will be studying about it in detail in the later lectures. Opsonization. So it enhances the phagocytosis of these coated microbes. Also certain circulating proteins like mannose binding lectin, they are normally circulating, so they identify the microbial sugars and bind to them, and this activates the complement. And which induces inflammation. So the first step is recognition of the noxious agent or the initiating stimulus for inflammation. So these are all the mechanism by which the leukocytes or other cells, they recognize the noxious agent. Second is the recruitment of leukocytes and plasma proteins to the site of infection or tissue damage. So the leukocytes and the plasma proteins, they are normally in the circulation and they have to be recruited to the site of infection or the site of tissue damage. So this is accomplished by the changes in the caliber of the vessels. There is vasodilation and also due to increased permeability of the vessels. Now the vascular changes, they are occurring because of certain mediators. So these leukocytes and plasma proteins, they leave the circulation and they come to the site of infection or the tissue injury. Third is the removal of the offending agent. So when the leukocytes, they come to the site of infection or the tissue damage, they become activated, and mainly it is the phagocytes that ingest and kill the microbes or ingest and remove the damaged cell or the tissue. Now fourth is the regulation of the inflammatory response. Now once the goal of inflammation is accomplished, the offending agent is removed, then the inflammatory response should stop. Fifth one is repair. Repair proceeds or repair occurs through a series of events that cause healing of the tissue. Now this healing occurs by regeneration of the surviving cells and by deposition of the connective tissue in the residual defect, which is called as scarring. So these are the 5 steps: recognition of noxious agent, recruitment of leukocytes and plasma proteins, removal of the offending agent, regulation of inflammatory response, and repair. So we can remember it by 5 hours. Now with the help of a diagram, we understand these 5 steps. So this is the diagrammatic representation of sequence of events in inflammatory reaction. So the first step is recognition by the tissue resident sentinel cells. So the microbes and the necrotic tissue, the molecules that are released from the necrotic tissue, these are recognized by the macrophages, dendritic cells and the mast cells, and there is release of some mediators like histamine and cytokines. Now these cause vasodilation and there is increased vascular permeability. So this helps in the recruitment of leukocytes and plasma proteins from the circulation to the site of infection or the tissue damage. So the third step is removal of microbes and dead tissue. So this is brought about by the macrophages, which ingest and kill the microbes and also remove the dead tissue. Then when the offending agent is removed or the goal of the inflammatory response is accomplished, then the response has to be terminated. So the fourth step is the regulation of the response, and the final step is repair. So the tissue defect, it is repaired by deposition of the connective tissue or by regeneration of the surviving cells. Now, what are the cardinal signs of inflammation? What are the cardinal signs of inflammation? So there are 5 signs. These are rubor, redness, tumor, swelling, calor or heat, dolor, pain, and the 5th sign, it was added by Rudolf Virchow. It is functionalism or loss of function. So these are the 5 cardinal signs of inflammation. So at the site of inflammation, there is redness, swelling, heat, and there is pain, and it is accompanied by loss of function. So why redness, swelling, heat occurs? Now there is vasodilation. So it means there is increase in the blood flow, and also there is increased vascular permeability. So there is exodus of leukocytes, plasma proteins, and fluid from the circulation to the extravascular space. So this leads to swelling, and increased blood flow leads to redness, and due to increased blood flow there is heat, and pain is due to release of some mediators of inflammation like prostaglandins, and loss of function is there. Let us discuss the differences between acute and chronic inflammation. So the onset in acute inflammation, it is rapid. Acute inflammatory response is self-limiting, and it occurs in response to those agents which are rapidly removed. So the inflammatory response gets cleared very fast. So the cellular infiltrate is neutrophils, and the tissue injury, fibrosis, is mild. So there is mild tissue injury, and it is self-limited, and the local and systemic effects, they are prominent. So acute, there will be fever, and if there is disseminated bacterial infection which can lead to sepsis, then there can be systemic inflammatory response syndrome, which can lead to some major pathologic abnormalities. The chronic inflammation, the onset is slow. It may take days to develop. The cellular infiltrate in chronic inflammation is monocyte, macrophages, and lymphocytes. Tissue injury and fibrosis is severe and progressive in chronic inflammation. The local and systemic signs are less prominent in chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation may develop de novo, or it may follow acute inflammation. Chronic inflammation occurs as a response to agents which are not readily removed, which cannot be readily removed. For example, tubercle bacilli, in the allergic reaction, the environmental agents which cannot be readily removed, and in case of autoimmune diseases where the immune response is against the self antigens. So these cannot be readily removed. So chronic inflammation occurs in these cases. So we have studied about the definition and general features of inflammation in the overview. In the next lecture, we will be studying about acute inflammation. I hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching.